Hi, welcome to SPED 5040. I'm glad you're here with us, and we're going to learn about early intervention in this class. I have to tell you that early intervention is one of my passions. It's where I started out with in special ed. When I was at Tennessee Tech, I was actually an English major for high school English teacher. That's what I was going to be, certified to do that. And I needed some money to go to school, don't we all? And one of my professors, who happened to be a special ed professor, I was taking my one required SPED class. She said, "Have you looked for a graduate assistantship?" And I said I hadn't. I didn't know anything about it. I was first generation going to school, right, at a higher Institute of Higher Learning. And so she said, try anywhere. It doesn't have to be your major. And so I tried special ed because I liked it. I'd always been around individuals with disabilities. I had a next door neighbor who had I don't know if it was kind of a mild or moderate, it wasn't mild, more moderate mental retardation or cognitive impairments, as we would call it now. And I had a friend whose brother had autism. And when I was growing up, that was very kind of odd. Nobody really knew what that was. But having been around these people, it was always very comfortable for me to be around people that were differently abled. And so therefore, I started filling out special education graduate assistantships. And the people that called were the home-based early intervention. And they took me an hour and a half away from campus to the worst part of town, in the projects, to a child that had a disability and with a family, not a great situation. And they took me there to see what I would do and how I would interact with the family. I sat down with the child and started playing, and I fell in love with home-based early intervention. So this is kind of what we're going to be talking about this semester, what kind of services we look at in birth 2-3. So I wanted to start out with giving you a little history of how children were viewed and how child care come into being, because it wasn't always there. We didn't always have some kind of daycare or a center. And so as we look at this, I want you to think in the historical perspective. I want you to think about what was it like in history at that time, because that'll kind of give you some reasons as to why we have some of the things that we do. Like what was happening in that time period definitely influenced early intervention. So we'll go on. I want you to think, okay, and I'll be quiet for a second, but how many types of home visitors can you name? What kind of people come into our homes? And then why do they do those types of visits? Okay. If I were to think about that, the first thing that I would think of would maybe be a home health nurse. Okay. If you think about people that are older or people who are really sick, they have someone that comes in, right? Let's see, what other kind of visitors do they have? We have, we have exterminators. If we have a problem with, say, roaches or bugs, spiders, we might come in, have somebody come and visit our home for that. There's also, say, physical therapy, right? If you have somebody that can't get to the physical therapist might come into the home. So you can think that there are various types of professionals, and why do they come on these visits? Because they have some certain knowledge that individual or that person in that home needs, and for whatever reason, the person can't leave the home to get the services that they need, and so the services come to them. So also, what do you think? And we kind of covered this earlier. What are some reasons professionals do home visits? And I'm thinking about professionals in the early intervention field specifically now. And if you think about it for just a second, it's the same reason, right? They come into the home because that child, for whatever reason, can't get what they need elsewhere, okay? Now, something that you need to know from the very beginning of going into early childhood special ed, and especially services birth to 3, families are very, very important, right? There are first teachers, there are people who really are with that child and knowledgeable about the child. They may not be an expert on the disability, they're an expert on the child, okay? And so, but for whatever reason, sometimes they can't go out for services. And not only that, sometimes it's better to have those services in the home, because you got to think about this, right? If you had, if I wanted you to learn to wash your hands, for example, would I say Timmy's playing, right? And he's in the block area. He's 4. Would I go to Timmy and say, "Okay, Timmy, we're going to go and we're going to wash our hands, and then we'll come right back to the block area"? Does that make sense? Not really. it makes sense to do the activity where you're going to be doing it. And where do babies and young children often spend most of their time? In the home. And so that's why we have professionals doing these kinds of things. But let's get back to the history of what's going on within history of children in general and disabilities in specific. So, as we kind of went over, there are different kinds of home visitors. There's healthcare workers, right? Those are your doctors, your nurses, and your healthcare. We now have the TV show Royal Pains, and I know that you may have seen that, where the guy's a doctor and he goes into people's homes. That's actually becoming kind of a new trend where doctors are starting to do that. I actually saw an advertisement for that. I think it was in Knoxville when I was traveling down there, and it was really, really interesting to me that the doctors are going into the homes again. It was like a sign, and it said, you know, if you want home doctor visits, call this number. And so we see that. We see nurses, right? We see all kinds of PT, physical therapy, right? OT, occupational therapy, speech, right? Also, we have educators, right? Preschool teachers go into the home. If you have looked at early intervention, or say Head Start, right? There's often an early Head Start that has home visits. Regular Head Start requires you to do home visits. When I was a Head Start teacher, we did, I think it was 4 or 5 visits a year to get the kids ready to come to school. So we see that. Homebound educators, okay, and these are for kids that are homebound. Maybe they're too sick to come to school, right? School systems provide a service for that child to have their education occur in the home. And then, of course, early interventionists, yay, us, right? We go into the home. So, why do we have early intervention? Okay, now, in a lot of these questions, what I want you to do is think of the money, okay? Because if you follow the money, a lot of times you'll get your answer, because money also is big and important. You want to think that something like this is going to not be affected by money, but let's face it, it does, okay? One thing that we've learned is that early intervention decreases the need for special education. The amount of dollars that is spent on a child to be educated that has a disability staggeringly decreases if we start early intervention earlier. So if a child starts it as 2 versus at 5, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference, because what we're hoping is that working with a child that young will ameliorate some of the issues that they have, and then they go into school and they may not need special ed, or they might only need some services, right, that they wouldn't have needed, okay? So early intervention decreases the need for special ed. It also decreases the need for custodial care. And by that, we mean there's less children going into foster homes. We also mean that you're not having kids go into, say, a resident facility, right? Long time ago, and we'll talk about this later on in the class too, but really, really young, small children went into institutions, right? And that's really expensive, honestly, and it's cheaper to have that child at home, okay? And so if we have early intervention, we have a decreased need for custodial care. There's also a decreased need for welfare. Okay, so there's going to be less students or individuals that are going to need to be on welfare, and you got to think, why is that? Because if they get early intervention, again, we're not having to provide the services later on, so there's a good chance that they're not going to have to go into the system of welfare. Maybe they can go out and get a job on their own. Also, we have found that delinquent behavior is decreased with early intervention, okay? Now, and we'll talk about these kinds of things later on too when we talk more in depth about behavior. But to give you just a little kind of advice or a little bit of snippet of way of thinking, I've been taught that behavior is a communication. And what is that child or that individual trying to communicate with their behavior? If you think of all behavior as that, then you're going to really be able to look at it and say, so why are they doing that? Okay, I'll give you an example. I have a 4.5-year-old at home, and today I was kind of rushed coming into work. It's the first day of the semester. That tells you when this was recorded, right? But it was the first day of the semester, and everything's kind of rushed and everything. Well, this is when he chooses to have a meltdown, okay? And if I wanted to look at that analytically, why would he have a meltdown at that time? I want you to think about that. Why would someone have a meltdown when things are a bit rushed at home? Okay? And if you think about it, he wasn't getting a lot of attention, right? So if he gets a meltdown, he has to get my attention. And so therefore, I stopped what I was doing. We dealt with the meltdown. I gave him just a little bit of attention, and then I went on. And so you can see why early intervention, because they're getting their needs met, is going to decrease delinquent behavior, and also will decrease how many kids are in jail, which is really cool because we don't want kids in jail, right? Or in the kind of settings where they have to be locked up. So let's continue. So I wanted to talk to you about how children viewed children a long time ago, because our view of children have changed over the years, okay? And in the 1700s or before, children were viewed basically as evil. They're selfish. They have the original sin, okay? And this goes back to, with Adam and Eve, and, kids are this way. They're basically evil. And so we also saw them as miniature adults. We didn't think of them as developing. We thought of them as just small adults, and then they'd get bigger and they'd be the same, okay? And so by age 7, yes, 7, they're seen as able to do adult work. And so that's exactly what was happening. They were out in the workforce, and they were often, at that time, of course, in the fields. They were doing all kinds of things like that. And so there was really a lack of sentiment for childhood, okay? So what that means is, now we think of, oh, it's a baby, oh, it's a child, they get to play, it's so much fun. Why do you think that there wasn't that sentiment before the 1700s? I want you to think on that for a second. Why were we not as sentimental back before 1700s about children? Let's think about it, okay? At that time period, nearly every family lost at least one child, okay? There was a good chance that that child was not going to make it to childhood. And I think part of it is self-preservation. If we don't fall in love with that child as much, if we know that they might be gone in an instant, that kind of thing, then we're not going to be as sentimental about childhood. And once you're able to work, because the family probably needed assistance with various things, once you're able to work, then you're going to have to be able to help with the family. There were no immunizations, of course, and so when something happened, when, say, smallpox came into being, it would sweep through the town, and a lot of people would lose children. That happened here in the United States as well, and this probably was after the 1700s as well. But if you look at, if you go up into Cades Cove, any of you all that are familiar with the area, and the Smoky Mountains National Forest, and Cades Cove is a little area that you can camp and that kind of thing. And in Cades Cove, there is a loop that you can drive with your car, or you can bike ride or walk. And on that loop, there are some churches. And I visited the churches a long time ago. They used to let you actually go up to all the gravestones. Now a lot of the churches have roped those off, and you can walk around them, but you can't actually see them as closely. But if you looked at the gravestones there, you would see a lot with the same date, okay? And it was around, if my memory serves correctly, around 1917, that kind of thing. There was a scarlet fever epidemic, okay? And so you would see one family, and there would be 2 or 3 children, and you could tell they were younger, like 12, 10 by the years on the gravestone. And so whenever you're losing a third of your children, like in Germany, where a third of the children were passed away before their first birthday, right? So if you got 3 kids in your family, like I have 3 sisters, that means one of us wouldn't have made it past 1, right? That's really staggering, right, to think that. And so we don't have that sentiment, okay? And in England, it was nearly a third to a fifth of all children died before the age of 10. And so that being the case, the sentiment of childhood is not there like it was whenever, or like it was when we were around, right? We kind of have a sentiment about it today. So, education in that time period. So you can kind of guess what education looked like in that time period. There was little to none. And who got the education? Can you think about it? Follow the money, right? Yes, it was people that were wealthy, or it was people tied to the church, okay? So monks, people that were going to be priests, maybe nuns, okay? And you got to think, why did they do that? They did that so they could read the Bible, spread the word on, and those were our educated people. And it's also because they had the time. You got to think, they may not have had to work the land as hard, right? If you're wealthy and you have somebody else doing it, you have the leisure time to learn how to read. But the general society was not educated, okay? And this gives us a reason why there's stained glass windows in church, Okay, think about all the beautiful churches that have all the beautiful stained glass windows. That came from the time period where if you can't read, you could look at the window and kind of get a story, right? And so, as I've said before, children worked. And I can tell you that this occurred in Appalachias, well past the 1700s, and we'll get more into that as well. But during this time period, children definitely worked. So, infants and young children with disabilities, what happened to those people, right? Because they were existing, right? Well, often they were euthanized, okay? And by euthanized, I mean that someone basically killed them. Either intentionally, they may have starved them, they may have left them out in the elements, and they didn't survive, or it could have been unintentionally, okay? And also, they were made fun of. Often this is who your court jesters were, right? Think of people that have, that are little people nowadays, right? You could see how they would be a court jester, or if they had a limp, how that would be. They would make fun of them, that kind of thing. They were traveling freak shows, okay? And also, they could be beggars on the side of the street if they had a disability, and they could have been locked up in prison or institutionalized. And often that kind of thing happened because maybe they didn't have the money to or the ability to work, and so they stole things, and then they got put in prison. So you can see how they were treated not very nicely. Now, I want you to think about something. How can you be unintentionally euthanized, right? Because euthanized means that you're killed, right? Somebody's killing you, okay? How could that happen unintentionally? Okay? Think about this. There could be, at that time period, a treatment that they did for you. Say, a long time ago, we used to use leeches to bloodlet, right? And they still do that. It's really interesting. They still kind of do that in our modern technology because they figure they found that's one of the best ways to do it. But they would put leeches on your body to make it intentionally suck out the blood. If the person didn't know what they were doing, right, and a little person, like if it's a child, has less blood, right, then that could kill them. Something else too, okay? When we feed individuals, when we eat, right, we have a mechanism in the back of our throat that makes us not gag or not take into our lungs what we eat, right? Because it closes off, the place where we breathe closes off, and the opening to our stomach opens up. Well, what if a child has a hard time with that? Okay? It could be that they're feeding him and they don't realize that it's causing them harm, right? We didn't have the technology to do a feeding tube or anything like that. So you could see how that could happen unintentionally and intentionally, of course. Now, let's go to Rousseau. Rousseau's a philosopher that we saw in France, as you can tell by the name Rousseau, and he kind of had a different point of view of children, okay? And it's colored how we've seen children since. He believed in the basic goodness of human nature. So he's saying children aren't evil, children are good. They're born innocent, okay? And they're not little adults, but it's a time period where they're developing, okay? And there's distinct things going on. And so we shouldn't treat them as adults. And so that was his view. And this view kind of caught on, right? People started seeing children in a different light. So, who's the father of development? Can you all remember? Do y'all know the name? I hope you're looking at it. Pick one in your mind of these four that are here on the screen. If you guess Piaget, ding, 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 you got it. Just so you know, if you're taking the Praxis for early childhood or early childhood special ed, anytime anybody says the word of development, they mean Piaget, right? And of course, if you see Rousseau, they mean children are good, not evil, okay? If you see Skinner, they're doing behavioral kind of things, and we'll talk about Skinner later on. And Vygotsky was also more of a kind of a developmental or a social kind of thing. He believed everything occurred socially. So again, if you have this on a test, Piaget is the answer if you see the word development. If you don't know, guess that if development is in the question. I tell you, that's pretty much going to be the right answer. So, in the 1800s, so we're talking about 100 years later, right, after Rousseau got things going and our mindset about what children were like, after that occurred, 100 years later, Froebels began kindergartens in Germany. Okay, if you ever wondered why the word kindergarten was spelled that way, with the T instead of a D, how we would spell it, it is because it began in Germany, and in Germany, they spell it with a T. So, and of course it just means like young gardens, right? So you can kind of tell where they might have had these classrooms, right? They were out often in nature and that kind of thing. And in the late 1800s, they started coming to the United States. So we started seeing kindergarten. Before then, there wasn't a kindergarten. And I can tell you too, in my time period, in a lot of places, there wasn't a kindergarten, okay? I have sisters that are older than me, and my mom actually took them to a different school district so they could have a kindergarten experience, because the one in which we lived did not have one. So, and then whenever I went into kindergarten, there was one. So that tells you that even though we may have some set dates on here, things are different in different parts of the world, depending on culture. There can be lags in the way of thinking, or in resources and money, right? So we didn't have it here. They started in the 1800s, but that doesn't mean that they were in every school in the 1800s. The idea came to the United States. Now, there was a nursery school, okay? Think about nursery school. Nursery school was younger, even smaller, right? So nursery school is going to be like 2, 3, 4, right? The young kids. They occurred in London and Italy around the same time, okay? So you got to think 1910. Okay, in the 1930s in the United States, that's when the nursery school kind of came here, that idea. What was happening during those time periods that we decided that we needed nursery schools? Can you think? If you thought of the Industrial Revolution, you are correct. What was happening in London and Italy, and then again in the United States, was we were becoming more industrialized, which meant more people working, okay? Also, if you guessed, during this time period, we were starting to have World War I, right? It was kind of during this time period as well. So that means more people in the workplace, more women in the workplace, and so somebody had to take care of the children, okay? So if the women were needed to work in the factories and that kind of thing, somebody had to take care of the children. And often before that, the kids were left running around outside the factory. Can you imagine in these days? That would be very difficult for us to think about, but they were left kind of to their own, and their mom might come out and give them lunch or something and then go back in, and they just kind of ran wild. And so somebody decided, why don't we start working with these kids to start learning things, right? And of course, as this kind of thing happened, more and more people started reading as well, right? So you see education changing during this time period too. But also, something else that you got to think about, if you've heard of Reggio Emilia, right? The Reggio Emilia is kind of a constructivist idea of kindergarten, right? And this idea is that children need to play, they need to do their own thing, it needs to be free form, right? And Reggio Emilia is the Italian, right? That's where that thought started, and it started in 1910. So you can see how all this kind of starts coming together, that we will have a historical side of something occurring, and then we have to adjust, right? We have to adjust either our way of thinking or how we do things, and that's how things like kindergarten and nursery schools came into being. Okay, so again, we kind of talked about this. Why is there an increase in popularity of nursery schools? Well, not only did the Industrial Revolution happen, like we talked to before, once the Industrial Revolution did happen, there were a lot of young children working. We were sending 7-year-olds down into mines, if you think about the Appalachian region and where we're at. They were going down there mining coal with Dad, okay? Dad's taking the coal out of the earth, the young kids piling it on, okay? And the more people that were helping, the bigger the salary of the people, so you can see why they wanted that. Well, in 1938, the child labor law started. And what happened was it limited what children can do and how long they could work. Notice it didn't say they couldn't work, right? It just limits how long they could work. They couldn't work any more, say, 10, 12-hour days, okay? And so also what happened was the Depression hit. Okay? And when the Depression hit, there were people who had the education to be a teacher. And what happened was there were no jobs. And so what FDR, that's Franklin D. Roosevelt, right? He had unemployed school teachers work in nursery schools. So what's happening is he is starting to put people to work. That was part of his New Deal, part of some of his work things to get America working during the Depression. And so that's how they thought, well, hey, we've got these teachers. They can teach older kids. They can teach younger kids. Therefore, we'll make them nursery school teachers. Also, now you've got to think we're heading into World War II. right? And during World War II, again, even more women went into the workplace. And because of that, we're going to need nursery schools. We're going to need childcare. And so you can see, again, how what's going on culturally or what's going on historically is affecting how we interact with children. So let's go forward a little bit, okay? What is early intervention? Okay? And this is the definition of early intervention. And when we think of early intervention within our field. Now, early intervention just means that you catch something early and you try to intervene, right? We can have early intervention with obesity with adults, right? So what we're going to do is teach them to eat better, and then therefore they won't maybe have diabetes later on. So early intervention can apply to other things, but in our case, we're talking about services, okay? We either say, in different states say it different, okay? Because I can tell you, in being in Tennessee, whenever I started, we said birth through 2, okay? I moved to West Virginia when I was teaching a professor in West Virginia University, and there they say birth 2, 3. So it could be birth through 2 or birth 2, 3. It's the same age. What they're saying is birth to 36 months, okay? But through 2 means, you know, all the way from their whole entire year that they're 2 till they hit 3, either way. And so what it is it's going to give them specialized services. It could be health, it could be educational, therapeutic, all of these services combined, right? And it's for individuals that qualify, okay? They have developmental delays or disabilities and their family. That's very, very key. I told you earlier in this lecture, families are very, very important, and they are, okay? And we'll talk more and see more about how important families are in some of our assignments and in some of the other lectures that you're going to be seeing this semester. Okay, so the history of early intervention. Okay, there was crude forms of early intervention beginning in the 1900s. Okay, so we're talking pockets here and there. And so you still had high infant mother mortality rates, meaning mom could die in childbirth as well, right? And then we had poor physical health of children. Often this was due maybe to malnourishment and things going on, and the children were still working at this time period. But we started seeing some early intervention where people were trying to do various things like helping children learn to walk, maybe helping them learn to talk. But again, this was more of the rare. It wasn't the what normally occurred, but we were starting to see some forms of it. Okay, now again, you've got to think too what was going on. Okay, in 1912, the Children's Bureau was established in the Department of Labor. You kind of laugh when you think about that. But remember, kids were still working, so they developed the Children's Bureau portion of the Department of Labor. Okay, and this is the first report ever in the United States where we see people with disabilities are talked about, and the first one where we say it's our duty to help those individuals or to serve those individuals. And they called these individuals abnormal or subnormal or suffering from mental and physical ills. Okay, now something else that you need to know about, and we talk about person first a lot, and in time we'll talk about it even more, but these are kinds of terms that we don't use today. And so this is something I want you to think about to a future lecture. It'll be the next one that you see. Why don't we call people this anymore? Why does our terminology in special ed keep changing? So I want you to think about that and hold that for the next lecture. But this is the first time the government acknowledged that the U.S. federal government is responsible for child welfare. This is the first time we ever saw that. Up until this point, only the families did what they needed to do, and only the families were responsible for the welfare, and the federal government and state and local government stayed out of it. Nothing going on. Okay, this is the first time we see it. Then we have 1935, and that's the Title V Social Security Act, okay? And this is part of the New Deal, right, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt started. We're starting to head into World War II, of course, and there's a whole global depression, but the United States definitely had depression going on. And so they start the Social Security Act. This is where we get Social Security. You know, people retire at 65 and they get money. This is the first time anything like that was ever talked about, okay? Now you have to remember, when they set 65 in 1935, do you think many people reached 65? not so much, right? Whereas now, because of better health care, better nutrition, jobs that aren't as dangerous, we are. And so this is why it's harder and harder for that to continue to work. But the Social Security Act not only worked with retirement and that end, they also started maternal and children health care services. And what they did was that they assisted states in creating services for children in rural and economically depressed areas. Okay? And so where do you think that would occur? Would it occur around here? Well, of course it did, yes, because the Appalachians have always been known for the economically depressed, okay? There's always been issues with poverty, there's always been issues with uneducated and all that kind of thing. And so, yes, this was targeted right at Appalachia, other places too, of course, but right at Appalachia, okay? And Part 2 of that had services for crippled children, and that's what they were calling it at the time, care. And basically, it didn't provide educational support, it provided medical support. Okay, so what they're saying is we're going to treat kids that have disabilities, right, or that are crippled from this. And then it also created Part 3, which are child welfare services, which is kind of what we know today as when the child welfare comes, they're making sure that you're taking care of your kids. This is when we first start saying, we care about your kids and you've got to treat them right and that kind of thing. So, and I kind of gave you a hint in this. Why did the Title V Social Security legislation occur in 1935 in the U.S.? If you think about history, of course, it occurred because of the Great Depression, right? People were out of work. There wasn't anything to do. They had to do something, or Roosevelt thought he had to do something, and so they started the Title V Social Security Act, which is why you get Social Security now taking it out of your check, right? All started back then, believe it or not. So if you look at more progression of legislation, these are programs that occurred in 1960. And while we talk about them, I want you to think what's going on in 1960 that might prompt this kind of legislation. Okay, first in 65, we have the Social Security Act, and this time it is the Title 19. So this is different. Okay, it's kind of an addition. If you go back to the last slide where we talked about the Title 5, this is like where they added to it. Okay, so this is Title 19, and in this they provided early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment, okay? Medicaid provided that, okay? So this is people that would not have had insurance, and so they're saying, if you don't have insurance, we're still going to do this. And again, it was targeted for poor, often rural children. So again, this was something that we saw a lot in Appalachia. There was also you had the war on poverty. So this would be when we had JFK, right? So John Kennedy was doing this kind of thing. And he was really, really aware of issues of poverty, okay? And his family also was very, very aware of issues with disability. And if you can think back why, they actually have a sister that has a disability. And so they created and did a lot of things that would benefit other people. They had money. They knew they could take care of their sister, but they knew there were other people out in the United States that couldn't. And so they set up some of these kinds of things. With war on poverty, what he was saying at that time period, that we were going to eliminate poverty. We were going to do things to eliminate poverty and issues that are occurring because of poverty, okay? And so they brought in a lot of different programs and assistance, and Head Start is one of those. Now, Head Start was not signed in by Kennedy. Head Start was signed in by Lyndon B. Johnson, okay? And why would that be? Because even though this was something that Kennedy wanted to do, right? Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson came in, and Johnson carried through with these ideals because, of course, they were president and vice president at the time, and he wanted to do that. And there are some very famous pictures of Lady Bird Johnson, his wife, visiting a Head Start in rural Appalachia, reading a story to the children that are sitting there. So Head Start, and if you think about what that means, you're giving children a head start in school to do well, because they were saying a lot of kids in poverty, they don't have access to the books, they don't have access to the teaching, the parents don't know how to teach them to do various things. And so we have Head Start growing so that these kids can get a head start on school. And so it's really interesting to see how that is still going on today, right? And we have early Head Start, and a lot of this is for child care for individuals, of course, that are in more of the poverty rate. Every child there, they can only have 10% above the poverty line, and they carry on these programs. It started when Head Start started, it was only part-time, and they want a lot of family involvement. They still would like a lot of family involvement, but you don't see a lot of family involvement or as much family involvement because now we're working a lot more, right? And so it's hard to do that sometimes. But you can see how all this came into being. It came into being in the 60s. And why was that again? You remember we told you to think back at history. There was a lot of civil unrest, right? This was the time period of Martin Luther King Jr. and March to Selma, and those kinds of things are going on. Everybody was wanting their rights, okay? And women wanting the rights to vote, people of color wanting the right to vote and be considered a citizen and a human being. And with that, you also have disability rights occurring. Okay, and so in the 60s, you were seeing people with disabilities standing up and saying, I want this too. Okay, now it wasn't as cohesive, and why might that be? Think about disabilities. Is a vision disability the same as a motor where you can't walk or that kind of thing? Are they the same? Is autism the same? If they have Down syndrome, is it the same? It's not. And so what happens, instead of disability as a whole pulling together as one group, you often had pockets of this is the autism group, this is the children with Down syndrome group, this is the people that are in wheelchairs group. You can see what I'm saying, right? And so it wasn't maybe as powerful of a force. It still got a lot done, but and it's still working to do a lot, definitely. But you can see how if we're united with color, well, we all have that. Right? We are all Latino, or we are all African American, or we are all Caucasian. With a disability, it's not that we're all blind or that we all use a wheelchair. Okay, so you can see how it isn't quite as cohesive. But legislation did occur in the 60s, which really informed how we see things and do things today. Now, in the 70s, and again, this is following the timeline of disability. Focus went from poverty to children with disabilities. In the 60s, everything's looking more at poverty. Let's end poverty and let's ameliorate poverty, and this will help us be able to treat a lot of things. Well, now in the 70s, early 70s definitely, we're starting to look at children with disabilities. And in 1972, PL 92-424 occurred, okay? And PL means public law. Okay, 92-424. If you see this is how you need to read it. If you see PL, what that means is that it is a United States law. Okay, the number there is not a year date, because if you look, it's in the 70s, right? It's not in the 90s. That is the number of the Congress, okay? Like if the Congress session were to start and you were to hear it, they would say, this is the opening session of the 124th Congress or whatever, okay? So it was the 92nd Congress, and the 424 means it was Bill 424. So this is Law 424. Okay, so that's how you read that when you see PLs like that. So therefore, something that has a lower number on the front, like 92, say you have 89, 92, they're older, right? The higher the number, the newer they are, because we're getting more and more Congresses, okay? And the number on the end just means that's the number of the bill they passed that year. So that doesn't help. But if you're trying to decide between two things, so like if you're taking the praxis again, we'll go back to that, or you're taking a test and you know one occurred before the other, you say, oh, this happened pretty early, well then it needs to be an earlier law, not a later law, okay? So that's how you read that. Public Law of Congress 92, and it's law number 424. In this, all Head Starts at this time period had to have at least 10% of their children with disabilities. And I can tell you they still follow that to this day, okay? And so if I have a Head Start classroom, they're going to want 10% of those children to have a disability. So if you have a kid or a classroom with 20 kids, often Head Starts that I work in or that I've worked in, and Head Start's definitely in this region, because whenever I was working in Head Start, I was in Blount County Schools, Maryville, and Morristown was our district office. And we often had 18 to 20 kids in a classroom, okay? If you're doing 10%, you're talking 1 to 2 kids, right? And so often I will tell you this as well, because they're not as equipped to handle kids with significant disabilities, they often went with the kids that were not as disabled. You most often saw children with speech and language issues, right? Maybe they had lisps, maybe they didn't talk as much, so you saw more of the milder disabilities. The exception of that is, of course, rural areas. Sometimes in rural areas, school systems use Head Start as their 3 to 5 program. Okay, and that's the next step right after birth to 3, and we'll talk about that more. But in doing that then creates more disability within the Head Start classrooms. Now, why do you think that they chose the number 10%? Why not have more kids with disabilities in Head Start? And it doesn't mean that they don't have to, that they can't have more. They certainly do in certain areas. But they want them to have at least 10%. Why is that? If you think, that kind of mimics the general population. You don't want to overwhelm a classroom with individuals with disability. What you want to do is you want the classroom to kind of work like general society. So in doing that, you're going to have people with disabilities in the same kind of way that you would in the general society. 10%, that is really good, okay? So let's go on. In 1974, the Council for Exceptional Children began the Division of Early Childhood. Okay, so this is not really a legislation. I just wanted you to be aware that Council for Exceptional Children was in existence before 1974. Okay, and that's the big Council for Exceptional Children is the big overarching program. It's kind of a place that I'm affiliated with, and a lot of special educators are affiliated with. They do a lot of research, they have a lot of conferences, and at that time they began Division of Early Childhood. And what CEC does is it encompasses all disability. And then what CEC did was there's different divisions. Okay, and they focus on a really specific expertise. And so in 74, the Division of Early Childhood was began. Now, in 1975, we have PL 94-142, okay? Education for all handicapped children, okay? You see how the language has changed again over time, and I want you to kind of think, why has the language changed? We've now changed from kids that are crippled, right? And before that, it was crippled kids that were they were talking abnormal or subnormal, and then they went to crippled, and now we're going to handicap. That's the word, okay? And what happened whenever you had this was you had FAPE, and FAPE is free, appropriate, public education, okay? And so what they were saying in 75 was that all kids or individuals that were handicapped that were 5 to 18 had the right to go to school. Up until this time, they may not have gone to school at all. And so they're saying here, now they have the right to go to school between 5 and 18. And then they told the states, and we really want you to serve kids that are 3 to 5 year old. Okay? Yay! We'll talk more about this later. So this was kind of one of the really big first handicap or kids with disabilities kind of legislation in the United States. It's a very famous one. Okay? Now, now in the 80s, what was happening in the United States, especially the early 80s? I don't know if you all knew or were heard or anything like that. There was a huge gas shortage, right? Billy Carter was in presidency, and there were crises in the Middle East. We had Iranian hostages. Iran had some Americans that were held hostage for a long time. And gas was extremely expensive. At that time period, it was as much as 60 cents a gallon, which I know some of you are out there just hee-hawing over that, chuckling, right? I know I would be. But I do. I remember driving with my parents, and yes, I am old, but I remember driving with my parents to the beach, and I remember them really upset because the gas was 65 cents a gallon when it was 55 cents at home, and because of being in a different state, and on the interstate it was much more, and they were kind of like, I can't believe it's this high, But there were lines for gas, and they would do things like only certain people could get gas at certain times. So they would maybe say the license plate number. If your license plate number began with an even number, you could get gas on Tuesday and Thursday, and if again with an odd number, it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or and then they would vice versa and that kind of thing. And there were lines. I mean, there were people that would go and wait in line to get gas. And so things were kind of in a depressive state, right? There was a budget crunch in the federal government. Things were not looking good, right? The gross domestic product was down, as you can see on the red arrow and the arrows there. The unemployment was up. Corporate earnings were down, and inflation was rampant. It was really, really bad. Now, at this time period, and then Reagan was voted in the office in the early 80s, and I guess I should go back up and say Carter was president in the 70s, late 70s, and then Reagan took office in the 80s, and Reagan attempted to clean up the mess that had occurred before. But all this was still going on. And so nothing was cut, which is good. Things stayed status quo. We didn't expand services or anything like that. It all just kind of stayed there, right? Now, in 1986, this is going to be the mid-80s, right? Things are looking better in the United States in the mid and late 80s. And this is when PL, right, Public Law 99-457 come into being. You need to star this law. You need to put all kinds of happy faces around it. This is a big deal law, especially for birth to 3. Okay? Now, what happened with this law is that 3 to 5, children with 3 to 5 had to be served. Okay? So before it was, we want you to serve them. Now it's you have to serve them. And in this law, they encourage states by giving them grant money. If you provided services for children birth to 3, we will give you grant money to provide those services. Okay? And at that time, we called it Part H. It is now, since new legislation has been passed and stuff, it is now Part C services. So we'll be talking about Part C services all semester because that's where we're focusing on 99-457 and early intervention. Yay! Right? And you'll notice even back then we emphasized families, okay? We got some really, really good early childhood practices going, and we started emphasizing families. And so that's kind of the timeline of progression. Now, just to kind of give you some more, in 97, right, and when the 90s hit, we had IDEA, right? We have a new idea. There was also a change in language. I don't have this on the slide, but we went from saying handicapped to words like disability, okay, so a further change in the language, and again, try to be thinking, we'll talk about it later, why is there this change in language? And the Part H services changed to Part C services, and then again, there's further emphasis on families, so we keep really seeing that being with families are very, very important. So, modern day early intervention, well, that's what we're going to talk about all this semester. And so I will see you next time. The next lecture is going to be early childhood special education and the law for that. So this is going to be a little more in depth about law and early intervention. And I cannot wait to see you at the next lecture.